So good evening, everyone. My name is Khalil. I'm manager with Battle River Research Group. Welcome to the Berg webinar. So today our speaker is Ted Nyberg. Uh, Ted Nyberg was employed by Alberta Agriculture for a little more than 33 years. Last 17 years, he was serving as a farm management specialist at Ag Info Center in Statler. Today, his presentation will focus on cropland rental agreements in Alberta, developing lease contracts and calculating rental rates. And if you have any question, please type in the chat room. And uh, welcome, Ted, and floor is yours now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Khalil. All right. I'm just going to share my screen. Good evening, everybody. Hopefully everybody's enjoying the warmer weather that we've been experiencing for the last day. So I think one of the things that we're going to find out in this session too is that, and given this what's happening this year, both with price and growing conditions, we could be in quite a volatile situation as far as cropland leasing is concerned this year. Stats Canada reports that farmers rent just over 22 million acres in Alberta, which is quite substantial. 45% of the ag land in the province is rented. And just over 21,000 farmers rent land with an average of about just under seven quarters. So there's a substantial amount of land in the province that is rented. Today, we're going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of leasing, the types of leases, cash versus crop share. I'm going to focus mostly on cash and crop share because they tend to be the majority of the lease arrangements in the province. There's about, and of those, cash is the predominant one. It's about 75, just under 75%. And then crop share is about 25%. There's a few minor other ones in there as well too, but they're just kind of few and far between. We're going to talk about the components of a successful lease, the landlord and tenant responsibilities, some of the legal and tax issues dealing with leasing land, and I think what everybody really wants to know is help in establishing a rental rate. So some of the advantages of leasing is obtaining capital. What we have typically is, a renter would like to use his capital to buy inputs, fertilizer, herbicide, stuff like that, rather than having all their capital go against mortgage payments. So it just increases their land base. We have increased efficiency. One of the things I did quite a bit when I was with Alberta Agriculture was to determine what the machinery component is in the province. And typically what our economists have always told us that you don't want to have more than 2 times your gross revenue per acre invested in machinery. And typically in our province, we're actually pretty efficient as far as machinery allocation is concerned. I think on average over 20 years, we're probably somewhere in that 1.5 times gross revenue per acre. There are times when we've jumped over the 2, but those were years when we had some low returns. Leasing land is a good opportunity for young people to obtain some farm experience. Leasing land also shares risk. And it helps in some of the family business arrangements, father to son transitions, things like that. And it also provides retirement income for those landowners that want to kind of stay involved with farming, but don't want to sell their land. Some of the disadvantages of leasing: it's not all sunshine. There's a lack of security of tenure. That security of tenure is somewhat mitigated by a good, solid lease arrangement, lease contract, but you never know, it can change. There's a lack of efficiency. Some tenants will say that they can't do the improvements that they wish. And, it depends on what the communication they have with their landowner. Lack of credit. If the bank wants to have some collateral, if you don't own any land or your land is already tied up, it could make a difference. Lack of bargaining power and managerial control. And this again goes back to, the agreement and the relationship between landlord and tenant. And sometimes we find with maybe landowners that have been farming for themselves for quite a few years, they still want to be able to control the production, and it may make it a little bit difficult, especially for some of the younger fellows that are trying to lease that land. There's a lost opportunity for any capital gain, and there's also the loss of the rollover provision and the capital gains exemption. And there's always people problems. I know in the course of my work with Alberta agriculture, it seemed like every now and then there was always some people problems running up, and that boils down to relationships. Okay, types of leases. We're going to discuss some of the types of leases. Cash lease, pretty straightforward. Figure out what you're going to pay per acre and go from there. There's a flexible cash lease, and that typically is tied to a yield and price base, and it can be complicated. And there could be some increased risk for both parties if the yield doesn't meet up to the tenant's response or expectations. He's going to be disappointed. He's got risk. You might have set a base rate of, say, 80 bushels of barley, and if it turns out you had only 60, you're going to be in kind of rough shape. And the other thing is the price could be going downhill as well. Crop share, as I mentioned earlier, it's probably about 25% of all the lease arrangements in the province. There's two different components of crop share. One is a 1/3, 2/3 crop share. And in a 1/3, 2/3 crop share, the landowner is responsible typically for the herbicide and fertilizer costs, and with canola. And this kind of goes back to those the old the TUAs that canola had. They pay for a third of the seed cost. The other component is a 1/4, 3/4, and the landowner doesn't share any of those costs. Joint venture, we don't see very much of that. It's fairly complicated, and asset allocations have to be really looked after and things like that too. So it gets pretty difficult for joint venture. One of the things we do see is sometimes custom farming tends to, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later in some of the legal and tax issues. And if a landowner finds that they're offside as far as taxes are concerned, and say with a rollover or capital gain situation, then they may take a few years in custom farming. In custom farming, they basically they do everything. Other than the fact that they're leasing out or they're hiring out the work, but they're doing all the managerial decisions. One of the reasons we see crop share as well too is that some of the landowners have the impression that by especially the 1/3 situation, that by sharing those inputs that they have farming income. According to Canadian Revenue Agency, that landowner also has to have a lot of managerial control. So what I try to tell people at that time is that they if they're going to have meetings with their tenants, they document them, take minutes, and sort of give an indication that they are actually making some management decisions. So what's the components of a successful lease? Of course, the names and addresses of all parties, the description of the property, and you have to be fairly descriptive of that. Things like, typically what you look at is arable land. arable acres. Should be describing any of the say well sites that are on there. Maybe there's a dugout or two or something, or a power line going through there. All that description should be included in that lease agreement. The lease length is important. Is it a year-to-year lease, or is it a 3-year plus? Typically, you're better off with the 3-year plus for a lot of different reasons. There's a lot more benefits to the tenant, a lot more control, a lot more security, and also they can do a lot of planning in terms of their crop rotations. The amount and payment of rent is important, and that payment of rent, typically we see that payment twice a year, once in the spring prior to seeding, and then once after harvest is the second. The payment is split in two, basically. Compensation for repairs to buildings, fences, improvements. The minor repairs are usually the tenant's responsibility. The long-term improvements, say you were looking to tile drain some land, and that's going to have a lot more long-term improvement for that land, and that typically is the landowner's responsibility. Rights to assign or sublet the lease. Not a good idea to give the in the agreement to be able to sublet the lease, because then the landowner doesn't have as much control over the sub leasee. So you probably want to make sure that is looked at. Production practices and management decisions. Some of the landowners, as I mentioned, they want to have a lot more hands-on. And it's their land too. They want to make sure that we'll talk about some of the responsibilities later on for the tenant. They have to farm in a husband-like manner, and so the landowner really wants to have an input into those production practices and management decisions. And some of those boil down to the record keeping component as well. Things like crop rotation. We do have some landowners that don't like canola. They're kind of one of this anti-GMO faction. Marketing is a decision, not so much on a cash rent basis, but definitely in a crop share situation. What are you going to do with the straw? We like to keep the organic matter in our soils, and so in some lease agreements, you'll see that the baling of straw is prohibitive. There are situations where the straw can be quite onerous, and it has to take it off. So those issues have to be addressed. And is there going to be any fall grazing out there too? And those are some of the things you have to look at. Grain storage, that's one thing too that you'll find as we get into the rental rates. If the landowner is supplying grain storage, that can amount to $1.50 to $2.50 a bushel per year, additional for the tenant. So that's 18 to 25 cents per bushel per year for a hopper bottom, and 12 to 18 cents per bushel per year for flat bottom bins. And so say on an 80 bushel crop or something like that, that could add another 10 to 15 bucks an acre for cash rent. Storage of grain and the equipment on this land at the start and the end of the lease. Typically, if a new tenant is coming in there, they want to have the grain bins empty. I think you have to identify any of the equipment that's on the land at the start so that it doesn't disappear. And you have to decide what the compensation is for property damages. Right of entry is important. The landowner has the right to inspect land and maybe remove grain stored at the start of the lease. The tenant has the right to remove grain at the end of the lease. The right of entry has to describe what an incoming tenant or purchaser should have the right to enter that land to do some work after harvest, maybe get the land ready for next spring. And and the and the right of entry when we go into a crop share situation is important for the landowner. And it's going to boil down to trust. It's going to boil down to relationship. And I've seen situations where on a crop share situation, maybe the tenant isn't all that forthcoming with how much fertilizer he's put on or how much yield he's had, and so maybe the landowner has to have the right for any kind of inspection to just kind of get an idea of what kind of yield he's looking at. Termination and what constitutes termination of a lease. Typically, in my experience, the biggest factor for termination is failure to pay rent. Some of the other termination factors could be improper production practices. They just don't agree. Yeah. Arbitration. We'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit later. Arbitration. There are some opportunities to have certified arbitrators to come together, and if there is a dispute, the other thing you could do is you've got some trusted neighbors. Maybe they can kind of help out and kind of settle differences. One of the things you want to put in a lease is the right of first refusal, either an option to buy or rent. For example, if somebody came along and offered you $3,000 an acre, you have that. The tenant should have the right to match that. That's the right of first refusal. And or on a rental situation, if you're paying say $60 an acre and somebody comes along and offers 70 to the landowner, you have the right to match that as well too. So those right of first refusal, both on buying or renting, should be included as well. What do you do with income support statement payments? Those really have to be looked at in how the terms of those payments are. I think one of the most recent ones we encountered was the carbon offset program that we had, Alberta Agriculture had. Those accrued to the land, or to the tenant rather. The landowner wasn't, and again, some of the tenants were good and they shared it with their landowner, but basically the carbon offsets, they were part of the say no-till, zero-till kind of issues, and so those are production practices that earn those offsets. What do you do in the loss of use of land? I don't think that's going to be an issue this year in terms of flooding, but there are times where we've had just tremendous amount of moisture and tenants lost the use of the land, and we're going to talk about some moral and legal issues later on about how to deal with that. And if land is prone to flooding, maybe that should be included as a clause. Surface leases, excuse me. Okay, there's basically two components to a surface lease. One is the right of entry. Of course, that goes to the landowner. And then there's the adverse effect. That goes to the tenant, because they're the ones that are being adversely affected by any well sites or anything else that's on the land. Patented crops. Okay, the landowner should be looking at what kind of crops are going on there. Typically they're the canola crops, and the tenant should make the landowner aware of that they're going to be on there. What are the ramifications? Can that crop be taken down? Those kind of things. So that should be addressed, the patented crops. Good record keeping, and I think record keeping both from a production point of view and also what what has been done to there is particular as we get into some of the environmental issues, and herbicides is the biggest one, is the type of herbicide that went on there, the amount, the timing. Those are issues, that can be involved with the record keeping as well. Any environmental hazards? Did you have a herbicide spill? That sort of thing too. That should be addressed. What to do with them? Liability. Okay, liability on both parts, both the tenant and the landowner. They typically liability insurance is designed to cover that. Property insurance, typically that's with any equipment and buildings. So what are the landlord's responsibilities? One of the things that I ran into quite a bit with Alberta agriculture was that we had what I call a lot of absentee landowners. They were landowners that maybe inherited the land and they were 2 or 3 generations removed from farming, and they had very little understanding of agriculture and the production practices. And it got to be, I found myself probably as in terms of extension work, doing more work extension in those landowners and helping them understand what they had to know as far as agriculture was going. So they have a responsibility for understanding the production practices. The landowner should have a written lease, verbal. The old adage, it's only as good as what it's written on. So if it's just an oral lease, it's pretty hard to do any legal action if it's required. The landlord is responsible for communicating, talking to the tenant, and making sure that communication is two-way. He should be flexible, he or she, and I'm saying maybe I'm being a little bit. We had a lot of women that rented land, and they have to be flexible as well too. And then it goes back to this understanding production practices and understanding agriculture. It has to be equitable. It has to be fair for both parties. Otherwise, I had a friend of mine tell me one time that you've always got to leave a little bit on the table for the next guy. So it should be equitable. The landowner is ultimately responsible for provincial ag acts, the Agricultural Pests Act, the Weed Control Act, the Soil Conservation Act, Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act, and the Agricultural Operations Practices Act. If there is any fines or remediation, the only place that they can go is against that land, and it's the landowner's responsibility for that. I mean, the tenant does have responsibility for that as well too, but if push comes to shove, it's ultimately going to be the landowner's responsibility. What are the tenant's responsibilities? Has to farm in a proper and husband-like manner. And I think most tenants know that too, because they like to, if they've got a good solid lease base, they want to make sure that that's maintained, and the relationship is important as well too. They should have a written lease, of course. Again, as with the landowner, communicate. They have to be flexible as well and equitable. Make payments at agreed rate and on time. As we get into the rental rate component a little bit later, I'm just going to share with you some situations that when we get into some parts, some areas that there's such a desire for renting land, and people are just do anything. They'll offer some, and we've heard of some really kind of crazy rates for leasing land too. But I had one situation where somebody offered some exorbitant rates for leasing land, but you know what? The guy never got paid for 2 years. So it doesn't matter how much you agree on it. You have to be able to make sure that you get that. What are the legal issues? The anything changed, both the original and any changes have to be written. There's a moral versus a legal distinction, and I mentioned the situation with the land flooding and stuff like that. You know, if you haven't got that spelled out in the lease, and you do have your land flooded, you know, morally, you'd think that the landowner would try to do something for the tenant and maybe forgive that lease that year. You know, or maybe they got froze out or something like that. Crop insurance didn't cover everything too, you know. So those are moral issues. But if you go to court with it, you know, the judge is going to say, well, no, that's, you know, you have to have it spelled out in the lease. Words of present demise. What that is lawyer talk for saying that the landowner agrees to rent this land and has the right to rent this land. Okay, you'll see that in the lease agreement. In leases over 3 years, there are some implied terms, and what that implied terms means is you do not have to have it spelled out specifically in the lease. The timeliness of payments, good and tenable repair, right of entry and inspection, and any landlord's recourse. Okay, in terms of some of the legal issues, it's going to be imperative for the tenant to have a good look at the landlord's title. Okay, make sure that the landlord that he's dealing with is on title, and that they've got everybody else that's on title covered as well too, because legally anybody else that's on title would have to sign that lease agreement. Now the Dower Act, what the Dower Act is that any for leases of more than 3 years, if the landowner lives on the land with his spouse, they have to have the spouse's consent. So the tenant has to ensure that if he's got a 3-year or longer lease, that he's got the spouse's consent, especially if they're living on the land. They should the tenant should be registering that lease. Now, what that means is if leases that are less than 3 years, say 1-2 year leases, they can put a caveat on the title. And if it's 3 years or over, they can actually register that lease on title. And so they'd register lease on the title. But if it's less than 3 years, it's just basically caveat. In terms of protected crops, the landowner has to be, you know, from a legal perspective, he has to understand what protected crops are on there. And typically those are those GMOs. And there could be some other crops that are under plant breeders' rights too that would be impacted by this too. So it becomes very imperative that the tenant mentions, or at least discusses with the landowner what crops are on there, and which is, you know, what could have some legal ramifications going forward. The landowner's liability for tenants' actions, if they, you know, if they've caused some damage maybe to the neighbor, or you know, to some infrastructure, say there was a well site there and you hit it with a tractor or something like that, and ultimately the landowner is going to be responsible for that action. Priority claims. Now, priority claims, a tenant can grant a security interest in growing crops, and that's only on a cash lease basis. That's you know, it's important from a cash lease point of view. The crop share situation under the Crop Payments Act of Alberta, that states that the landowner's share in his property as soon as the crop is seeded. So there won't be any priority claims against the crop on a crop share situation, with the exception of the Federal Bank Act, and that tends to override that exemption the Federal Bank Act is federal bank. The federal legislation supersedes the provincial legislation on that. Now, what a priority claim is okay if the tenant has you know, offered security on his crop, and then it gets taken over, and the landowner, he's kind of second fiddle as far as that's concerned. What are the tax issues? Okay, one of the things that comes up quite a bit is it rental income or is it farm income? From the CRA's point of view, the Canadian Revenue Agency's point of view, it is rental income and not farm income. And we see situations on a crop share basis, particularly, especially the 1/3, 2/3, where the landowner strives to have it deemed farm income because they still want to take some advantage of some of the benefits as far as farm income is concerned. The rollover provision and the capital gains exemption. Under the rollover provision, if you rent your land for more years than you farmed it, you're offside. So you wouldn't be able to roll over that land to the kids or to the spouse for that matter. So this is where in situations such as this, under the rollover provision, where landowner finds that they're offside, they may go into a custom farming agreement for a number of years so that they're basically doing the farming and rather than renting it. Now, under the capital gains exemption, it has to be farmed for 5 years by the landowner, and any land that was acquired after 1987 it must be owned for 24 months prior to the sale. And for 2 years, the gross farm revenue of one of the qualified users, whether it's a son renting it or from dad, the gross farm income of one of the qualified users who's actively engaged in farming must exceed income from all other sources. Okay, and one of the things I mentioned in the rollover provision too is if the landowner wants to roll over the land over to the children, and what the rollover provision does is it allows a landowner to roll over that land to a successor for anywhere between their adjusted cost base and fair market value. Okay, now if they rolled it over at fair market value on a forgivable note, it's not a big deal. But if they happen to roll it over at their adjusted cost base, and then the child sold it in the next year or two, then that attributes back to the landowner, to the original, to dad or mom, and in that situation, it could be fairly costly from that point of view. If they rolled it over at fair market value on a forgivable note, and there's going to be some considerations on that forgivable note that have to be addressed. But again, if the successor happens to sell it within 3 years, then the capital gains will be disallowed on that because it attributes back to the parents. There's such a thing as a non-resident withholding tax. For the most part, it's not a big deal. But if the landowner happens to be a non-resident, say they're Bill Gates. Somebody told me the other day that Bill Gates is now the largest owner of farmland in the States, and I could see him coming into Canada. But in that case, the non-resident withholding tax is 25% generally, 15% for Americans. So Gates is going to get off a little bit easy that way, and that has to be submitted to the Canadian Revenue Agency. There is GST on farmland rental. Typically, it's a wash, particularly if both the landowner and the tenant are registered for GST. Here's a word of caution though for landowners that if you don't have to charge GST if your rent is less than $30,000 a year. So there may be a tendency for landowners, once they're kind of retired and just renting the land out, there may be a tendency to deregister. But according to Canadian Revenue Agency, that deregistration is going to be a deemed sale, and so there's going to be GST on that sale at fair market value. So I think in most cases it's just as safe for the landowner to stay registered and not have to worry about that. Okay, establishing a rental rate. This is where it's going to be pretty hairy this year. It's based on yield and price, primarily yield and price, and that's it's the yield and the price. It's basically the net returns that allow you to pay that cash rent. Alberta Agriculture has done a survey in the past, but in my estimation, it's not very reliable. For one thing, for example, here in the county of Stettler, for years they used to say that cash rent was $50 an acre. Well, in the southeast part of the county, you'd be hard pressed to justify 30, whereas in the northwest you could justify 70. But the statisticians, they blended it all together and called it 50. So, one quarter side by each would just you'd be kind of offside. You have to consider risk and uncertainty. What you're looking at is a blended rate. One of the things we've ran into in the past with canola in particular, it's always been the golden child in terms of yield and production and returns. Sometimes in the last few years, though, it's kind of lost a little bit of its flavor. But our fieldmen, they don't like to have more than agronomists don't like to have more than 1 in 4 years canola in a rotation because of things like clubroot. What I've used is a program called Crop Choice, and what it allows you to do is if you put the legal land location in, and this one's got barley and canola and wheat, and you click on the crop insurance, it'll give you an individual base coverage for those crops on a particular township. So what I did is used AFSC data for township 39, range 40 or range 20, west of the 4th. Barley indicated that barley was 74 bushels the acre and priced at $6.60 per bushel. Gave us a rental rate the year they put in barley in $92.41. Now what that is basically you take a quarter of that yield and then multiply it by that price and then discount it 25% for risk and uncertainty, and that'll give you that rate. Same thing with the hard red wheat, 53 bushels at 826, 8208. Now those are some fairly current numbers that I used. I'm going to digress a little bit on this canola one. I think there's going to be some volatility in the canola pricing this year. Yes, it's very strong right now, but what I did is I looked at the NOV futures for canola and worked it down to 1404 because that's basically the return on new crop canola that you're going to get. So still, I mean, it's going to allow you to have, if you put canola in that year, you could afford to pay $100 an acre for cash rent, assuming you get that on that particular township, you got 38 bushels the acre. Now, those are just some rates that AFSC has come up with. You may find that through your production practices that or your landowner says, yeah, no, I can, you should be able to produce 45 bushels an acre. So they're going to bump that up a little bit. So again, when it comes down to that negotiation, you kind of have to agree, both the landlord and the tenant have to kind of agree to what kind of yields you're looking at. So if I go with a blended rate of 1 year of barley and 2 of wheat and 1 year of canola, person could afford to pay roughly about $89, $90 cash rent. Like I said, that's a base rent. I mean, if you're looking at, another $10 to $15 for bin rental, you could probably pay a little bit more. The other thing that comes into mind too is your local area. What is the demand for cash rent? I mean, is there a lot of demand for cash rent and very little land available? That's going to add a little bit of a premium. And on the reverse side is if there's a lot of land to rent but very few tenants, that's going to cause a kind of a little bit of a discount. And if we go to 2 years of barley and one of wheat and one of canola, we can come up with just about $92 an acre cash rent. So you can see the mix is really going to have a bearing into what your cash rent could be. And you know what? With that kind of blended cash rent, it might be just as well for somebody to go straight barley for 4 years too, because you're getting the $92 an acre right then and there. So I went back to 5 years and looked at the same prices, or at the 2016 prices, using the same yields. Barley then was $3.46 a bushel, so you could only afford to pay $48 for barley. Wheat was $6.59 a bushel, $65.49, and canola was $11 a bushel. So on a blended basis, the 1 year of barley and 2 of wheat and canola, $65 cash rent an acre, which was about 28% less than current. And 2 years of barley, 1 year of wheat, 1 year of canola, 35% less. And that just goes to show you that, what commodities you put in there can really have a bearing as to what your cash rent's going to be. There's another way of determining cash rent. And this gets, this is for managers that have a good understanding and a good, have developed their contribution margin calculations very well. This is some estimated production costs and returns for black soil zones that Alberta Agriculture. This is the 2021 estimated production costs. We go down to the to the canola here, for example. That's 200. And what you do is you take the contribution margin, cut it in half, and then again discount it another 25% for risk and uncertainty. And you can see that half of this is 140, and if you discount it at 25%, you're looking at about $105 an acre, which is not too far off the other calculation. The other calculation might be a little bit easier, but one way here, they've, in this example here, they've got 46 bushels of canola, but they've priced it up, about 65 cents, 70 cents less than what I'd used in my calculations. And the same goes for some of these others, like for the feed barley, 254, and so if you cut that in half and discounted it, you're going to come into a pretty close estimate of what your cash rent should be. But this takes a lot of work. Anybody wants some more information on leasing cropland? Alberta Agriculture has a pretty good book available, and it's available at their publication office, the 1-800-292-5697, or you can order it online.
Nice webinar.
That's good to hear. Glad everybody enjoyed it. So
thanks a lot, Ted. Have a good evening.
You too. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.